You know that this is one of my favorite maps. When I'm sitting at my desk, it's the one closest to me on my left, right on the wall. It's a gorgeous map, originally made in 1700 for a sort of school atlas, for a really, really posh school. Beautifully colored by hand, it claims to be a map of ancient Africa, Africa at the time of the Greeks and Romans. There's so much interesting stuff on this map, I'm going to be able to milk it for at least 3 or 4 videos. The real source of the Nile, weird animals that prove it wasn't just sea monsters that map makers obsessed over. But for this video, we're zooming in on this one word right here, Troglodytae. That's right, straight out of the D&D Monster Manual. Today's video is going to be another exercise in cryptocartography. Where cryptozoologists hunt down Sasquatch and other real-world monsters, we hunt down the monsters and myths that appear on our maps. And we're serious about this. We're going to be looking at every possible source and analyze every connection we can. Get ready for a deep dive into classical literature, medieval myth, the beginnings of anthropological science, early speculative fiction, and even a little bit of role-playing games. We'll figure out who these troglodytes were and why they made such an impact on our collective imaginations. Welcome to the Eye of History, where we're about all things regarding maps and map collecting. If you like deep dives into history, science, technology, culture, please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps geeky channels like this one. We're going to attack this chronologically, starting with the most ancient sources. After we've queried the classic authors like Pliny, Strabo, and Herodotus, we'll move to the medieval legends, followed by post-medieval maps, like my lovely example. Next will be the early naturalists, for whom the troglodytes were part of a broader understanding of humanity, its races and relationships with other species. We'll look at literature, from the first appearances of troglodytes in speculative fiction, right up to the modern writers. We'll look at the troglodytes of fantasy role-playing games, where most of us first met troglodytes. But archaeology will get the last word. We'll test our fantasies against the impartial reality preserved in dry stones, bones, and pottery shards littering the African desert. The earliest mention of the Troglodytae come from the usual source, the so-called father of historians, Herodotus. He describes the troglodytes as living in Libya, adjacent to the Garamantes, a nation that is very well known in history. He claims that the Garamantes hunted the Troglodytae, which is perhaps why the troglodytes are, he claims, the fastest runners in the world. Herodotus' troglodytes eat reptiles, including snakes, and their language was unlike any other language known to him, and sounded like the screeching of bats. Aristotle weighed in his own opinions about a century later. He placed the troglodytes along the Upper Nile, although it isn't so clear just how far up the Nile he means. His troglodytes have 2 distinctive qualities. They are horsemen, and they are dwarfishly small. He further suggests that they are the pygmies of legend, which is incredibly ironic. To Aristotle, pygmies were legend and troglodytes were fully real. To us, pygmies are fully real, troglodytes are a fictitious monster. We get a couple fragmentary mentions of the troglodytes from 2 other Greeks, Euphorion and Pythagoras. No, not that Pythagoras. From these 2 sources, we learn a little of troglodyte music. They played the sambuca and the pandura. One author believes that they invented the sambuca. Both of these are stringed instruments that are among the panoply of similar instruments that were widespread in the classical world. We get the additional tidbit that their panduras were made of white mangrove, which is the first clear indication that we are in fact talking about the same troglodytes as those shown on my map, as white mangrove grows on the shores of the Red Sea. Our authors apparently met troglodytes at the Isthmian Games held in Corinth. It seems likely that they came as musicians, not athletes. We have only a few fragments from either of these authors, and if either thought that their singing sounded like bats, we have no record of it. If all of Agatharchides' works had survived, we might not have needed to make this video. He wrote a 5-volume treatise on the troglodytes, none of which survives. What little of his works do survive tell us of troglodytes living on the African shores of the Red Sea. Most were sophisticated tribesmen, divided into principalities and ruled by princes. These troglodytes were herdsmen, living on a diet of milk and clotted blood and slaughtering only the old animals for meat. He also states that they killed the old men when they could no longer follow the herd. They did live underground, but in spacious vaults, neatly arranged in a way that reminded Agatharchides of the catacombs of Naples, a photo of which I used in this slide. But Agatharchides also mentions that some troglodytes were not so sophisticated. Some lived a, quote, naked life, their wives and children living no better than cattle, having no shame or honor and living only for the basest pleasures. He considers particularly primitive their way of fishing, eschewing nets and boats and using only simple tidal traps that they built of stone. He doesn't mention whether these cruder troglodytes live in caves. As we move from the Greek sources to the Roman, we get very little new information. Diodorus and Strabo do little more than repeat what they learned from Agatharchides and others. They confirm the idea that the troglodytes were herders. Strabo adds that other troglodytes lived near the Danube River in Europe, but we don't learn much else from him. Strabo and Diodorus are quite kind to the troglodytes compared with other Latin authors. Pomponius places them in Libya, west of the Garamantes. These troglodytes are clearly subhuman. To quote, "They own no assets, and rather than speak, they make a high-pitched sound. They creep around deep in caves and are nurtured by serpents." But it was Pliny the Elder that cemented the troglodytes' reputation as subhuman brutes. He places the troglodytes in west-central Africa, along the Niger River, listing them among a parade of bizarre oddities. Like Pomponius, his troglodytes can only squeak. They live in caverns and survive on the flesh of snakes. For Pliny and Pomponius, the Niger River is a fantastic menagerie. It seems to me that as Rome finished consuming Egypt and the once exotic Nile Valley became just another granary, they took all the wild mythologizing about the Nile River and transferred it to the Niger, amplifying the legends in the process. I suppose this is a good way to measure the limits of any civilization, by finding that line beyond which their imaginations overwhelm their information. But even as Pliny considers the troglodytes of the Niger River as subhuman brutes, elsewhere in his writings he expounds upon the troglodytes of the Red Sea coast quite respectfully. These troglodytes have towns, markets, and traders. From them the empire purchases myrrh, ivory, tortoiseshell, hippopotamus hides, pet monkeys, and slaves. There are several troglodyte nations. Indeed, it seems that he uses troglodyte to refer to all the people of that region. In Pliny, though, there is something important missing. The L. Pliny seems to have spelled the word Troglodyte. He's not unique in this. In fact, throughout the classical area, we see both Troglodyte and Troglodyte, and the same authors using both. Obviously, we don't have anything written directly by the hand of Pliny or any of our authors, so it's hard to know whether we are seeing a choice by the author or by the copyist. We'll return to this point later. We'll see that losing that L is like moving from a cave into daylight. Or perhaps not. Our final source from the classical age is Plutarch, who writes of the charms of Cleopatra. More impressive than her beauty was her wit and intelligence. Plutarch claims she could speak over 7 languages. One of them was the language of the Troglodytae. He makes no mention of squeaking or screeching. As I started researching medieval literature, looking for mentions of troglodytes, I was surprised by the general paucity of references, either in art or literature. Medieval literature, both secular romances and Christian tales, are replete with monsters of all sorts. Surely these squeaky, snake-eating cavemen would have been amongst the most popular. But in fact, they weren't. It seems that Pliny flooded the market with his bizarre aberrations. He had goatmen, satyrs, and himantoppodes, men who could only crawl. He had headless men whose faces were on their chest, and men so stupid that they cursed the sunset, unaware that the sun would rise again in the morning. He had dreamless men, men who worshipped the forces of hell, men who used no names. And it should be added, the Celts, Germans, and other cultures brought their own myths of monstrous races. The troglodytes were just squeezed out. I think there is more to it, though. The lands associated with the troglodytes were overrun by the armies of Islam in the 7th century. To Christian Europe, they now had no relevance, mere names preserved in musty texts. If there had ever been a true troglodyte culture, it was now beyond the grasp of European knowledge. But if the troglodytes didn't have much impact on medieval mythology, They certainly did on post-medieval map making. In large part, this is due to references in Ptolemy's Geographia. I didn't mention this early because Ptolemy didn't bring anything new to our earlier discussion of the classical sources. In fact, he did nothing more than state where the troglodytes belonged on this map. Medieval scholars in Europe did not even have access to the Geographia until very late. But from the Renaissance forward, not only did cartographers have access to Ptolemy's masterwork, they were slavishly devoted to reproducing it. And so the troglodytes began appearing on map after map. In doing so, the cartographers of the 16th century were sincerely providing the most current information they had available. Few Europeans had any direct knowledge of the Muslim lands beyond the port cities and Silk Road marketplaces, and so the cartographers had no better description for the troglodytic lands. By the mid-17th century, this was no longer the case, and the term starts to drop off our maps. But starting in the 18th century and accelerating in the 19th century, historical maps became very popular. My own map was an early and excellent example. These maps were meant to accompany school books and classical readers, and they represented the world as it was in the classical era. By including the Troglodytae, these maps promoted the myths, and what was nearly forgotten in the medieval era again became common knowledge, at least among the educated, once again. In the mid-18th century, the troglodytes went from a cartographic curiosity and barely remembered legend to a common scientific and cultural term. Cartography kept the word and the legend alive, but it was biology that pushed the troglodytes forward. In fact, the natural sciences needed the troglodytes. These were the early days of the biological sciences, before they were even called biology or zoology. Scientists, who again weren't even called scientists yet, were confronted with the vast diversity of species in their ever-expanding world. They struggled to organize and categorize all the plants and animals that had been and continued to be discovered. The most popular scheme that they cooked up was the idea of the great chain of being, the idea that all the animals of the world could be lined up in order of ascending nobility, from mollusks to arthropods to fish to amphibians to reptiles to mammals to man. At the time, it was a reasonable idea, echoing the realities imposed by evolution, and for a while it was the most popular way to organize species. It did, however, break down in places, and one such place was humanity itself. The gap between human beings and the next noblest creature seemed far too large. Keep in mind that at this time there was not a single gorilla specimen, even a skeleton, in all of Europe, and only a handful of chimpanzees had ever been seen. To fill this gap, naturalists looked to the old classic texts, where they found the troglodytes waiting. And once the idea of the troglodytes as a missing link gained currency, naturalists inevitably began connecting the reports of man-like creatures, gorillas and orangutans, to the troglodytes. It was in 1758 that the concept of the Great Chain of Being gained a rival. Carl Linnaeus created a new system, a hierarchical one, which represented the complexity of nature far better than that simple chain of being. His system broke down organisms into phyla, classes, orders, families, genuses, and species. And he didn't just formalize this hierarchy, he established the criteria to be used in drawing the lines between each group. Vague notions of nobility or complexity were replaced by more objective criteria. This was an enormous step forward for biology, and an inspired one too. Linnaeus brilliantly demonstrated the importance of ignoring some of the most obvious features, such as size, color, and behavior, and concentrating on subtler traits, especially sexual morphology. He then applied his ideas by cataloging a good number of organisms, more successfully with plants, which were much easier to study than animals. For as brilliant as his methods were, Linnaeus was still hamstrung by a paucity of data. This was nowhere more apparent than with the genus Homo. In this genus, he placed the troglodytes. Although he had the orangutan in mind, he took the classical authors seriously enough to state that the species was also present in Ethiopia, and he named Pliny as his reference. From his explanation, it's obvious that the reports he had of the orangutan gave the species too much credit. Quote, "It is strange that he can use fire and cook flesh, though he also eats raw meat, according to the testimony of the travelers." we shouldn't be too surprised by the confusion. Linnaeus struggled with whether to place the troglodytes in genus Homo or genus Simia. His notes are a lesson in adherence to scientific rigor, even when the conclusion may be uncomfortable. He states flatly that he could not find enough specific distinctions between the orangutan and human to put the former in with Simia. Others could, though, even before more accurate reports of the orangutan appeared. In 1760, Linnaeus's pupil, Christian Hoppe, renamed the orangutan Simia pygmaeus, switching them from being the legendary troglodytes to legendary pygmies. The chimpanzees soon took on the mantle of troglodyte, gaining the formal name Simia troglodytes in 1775. The chimps' high-pitched screeching and their occasional consumption of snakes may or may not have been coincidental to the identification. Eventually, the chimps became pan-troglodytes. The pan came in 1816 and was apparently a reference to Pan, the god of satyrs. Satyrs were one of the races mentioned by, you'll never guess who, Pliny the Elder, as living in Central Africa. So the chimpanzee is actually named for two different legendary species. The use of the word troglodyte in taxonomy did not prevent the term from being used elsewhere in science. Historians continued to call the Red Sea coast the Troglodytic region throughout the 19th century. And troglodytes was the scholarly name given to anyone living on this troglodytic coast that wasn't an Arab and wasn't an Egyptian. But it was the discovery of Neanderthal caves in the 1820s that brought the word to the tongues of ordinary people again. When the first traces of cavemen were discovered in Belgium and Britain, troglodyte was the word that came quickest to people's minds. It was used informally or as an adjective like troglodytic lifestyle, not as a formal designation. Eventually, in 1864, the word Neanderthal was coined and quickly became the standard term. The word troglodyte would never again be used in the natural sciences. But it would survive in literature, as no less a writer than H.G. Wells found it the perfect way to describe the Morlock in his 1895 classic, The Time Machine. The Morlocks were, quote, ape-like troglodytes who live in darkness underground and surface only at night. Other writers would echo Wells, particularly in pulp fiction, though less than I expected when I started researching this video. Much later, Philip Dick, Robert Heinlein, and Jorge Luis Borges would each use the word to describe regressed humanity. But it wasn't literature, but Dungeons and Dragons that really brought troglodytes out of obscurity, while also changing them from mammals to the reptilian monsters we think of today. Although literature is filled with creepy, primitive human-like creatures, even reptiles, it was E. Gary Gygax's own idea to take the troglodyte off the human evolutionary, or de-evolutionary, ladder and merge him with the reptilian creature of the Black Lagoon. Whether you consider this an inspired creation or a derivative mashup likely depends on your appreciation for Gygax's offbeat sensibilities. Regardless, the impact he had on our collective imaginations is hardly any less than that of Pliny the Elder had 2 millennia earlier. It is unfortunate the political and security considerations have largely kept archaeologists away from the troglodytic regions. Only recently have any significant excavations been made in the area. The most important has been the study of Berenice Troglodytica, which for centuries was the largest port and marketplace in that part of the Red Sea. Berenice Troglodytica was founded in the 3rd century BC by the Greek rulers of Egypt, and it thrived for over 4 centuries as Upper Egypt's main outlet to the Red Sea. Archaeologists excavating its ruins have made some interesting discoveries. Although in most respects it seems a fairly typical Greek city, it had an unusually large and diverse foreign element. In particular, it had the largest Indian community in the Mediterranean world. As interesting as that may be, it means little to us for this video today. The archaeologists have found no sign of cave dwellers and no descriptions of weird, screechy languages. They found some mining activity and inscriptions in conventional Greek. The Romans also left a mark on the region, most notably with several hydruma, fortified watering holes for the benefits of caravans. But their footprint was light, and again, archaeologists have found nothing to suggest the existence of a cave-dwelling race. It's not as though there are no cave dwellers in the Sahara at all. On the other side of Libya, in Tunisia, there are a couple well-known settlements of modern cave dwellers. Portions of Star Wars were filmed at one of these. But as primitive as this lifestyle seems, These settlements are actually very recent. They have no connection to our troglodytes, and so far, no one has discovered the remains of any similar settlements dating to the classical era. It's time to put it all together. It turns out we don't have one cartographic troglodyte to explain, but three. One on the Danube River near the Black Sea, one on the Sahara just west of Egypt, and the most prevalent one on the Red Sea coast. We'll start by dispensing with the Danubian troglodytes. The only literary evidence we have is just one brief remark from Strabo and later people quoting Strabo, in particular Ptolemy in his Geographia. The only physical evidence is the rather banal fact that the local Dacians, like people almost everywhere, did use caves as hidey holes at times. There's no point digging any deeper. This is a dry hole. Among modern scholars, it is the Sahara Troglodytae that has received the most attention, almost to the point of erasing the other locations from memory. That is due entirely to a theory proposed about 50 years ago by a particular linguist. Before I give the details, let me inform the young people watching this that the 1970s and 80s were a golden era for linguistics. That was before we had gene sequencing technology. So whereas today historians and anthropologists are constantly taking DNA samples and running them through the 23andMe type analyses, genography it is sometimes called, back then they tried to do the same sorts of analyses with languages. Whereas today we work to establish relationships among ancient peoples, tracing migrations and identifying populations by sampling their genomes, in those decades we looked at their languages. It seemed like a step up. Before linguistics, we mostly just compared pottery shards. Unfortunately, languages are nothing like genes. They are far more mutable than people then imagined, and the golden age of linguistics is over. Some of the linguistic-based theories in anthropology have survived with some refinement. More have been superseded by new theories based on stronger genetic evidence. The linguistic theory of interest to us revolves around Pliny the Elder and that L that he dropped from the name. Troglodyte doesn't mean caveman. In fact, it doesn't have any obvious etymology or meaning in Latin at all. We already noted that copyists throughout history have included or dropped the L somewhat haphazardly. But according to the Oxford Classical Dictionary, the original word was troglodyte, and it was the error of the copyists to add the L. According to this theory, the Trogo is an adaptation of Tuareg, or more precisely, Tuareg and Troglodyte are derivatives of the same ancient stem word. The degree to which linguists held sway over anthropology at the time can be seen in the regard that this thin theory still has. Consider this entry in the Oxford Classical Dictionary, in which the etymology is not just taken as fact, but inspires the statement that there are no caves in the deserts of eastern Africa. We're talking about an area larger than Arizona, a wind-blown desert at that. It takes more than a PhD, it takes an Oxford PhD, to be so enamored with a flimsy theory based on fragmentary manuscripts as to write as fact something so obviously ridiculous. There are, in fact, caves in the eastern Sahara. What doesn't exist in that region is the Tuareg. Definitely not in the Red Sea region, and generally not so near Egypt that they could have had all the intercourse described in the Ptolemaic documents. Perhaps the Tuareg migrated west at some time, but if so, we have no evidence of it. Today, and to the best of our current knowledge, in classical times as well, the Tubu people stood between Egypt and the Tuareg, and the Tubu language is completely different. I don't mind a wrong theory. I only rant against its elevation to a status disproportionate to the underlying investment of fact. I have my own theory of the troglodytes, but before I start, I will give this disclaimer. This theory is simply my best reading of the evidence I have shared in this video. I can't call it definitive, as we don't know enough to exclude other possibilities, and we must always be open to future discoveries. Perhaps someday a troglodyte burial will be discovered, and we'll have the means to do a genetic analysis. Until that day, I believe that this theory is the best available. Let's start with the basic observation. There are caves in the eastern desert, and wherever dry caves are present, humans tend to use them. Herders especially find rest and relief in their cool shadow. Any foreigner, passing sailors, merchants in their caravans, Egyptian officials, might observe these herders and their simple habits. These cave users carried little, wore little, and other than their animals surely appeared crude and impoverished. All the evidence to the contrary they would have left in their village, which might be several days' travel distant. So thus we have our first reports of primitive cave dwellers. Of course, their language is described in terms of animals, bats in this case. Foreign languages are almost always described in bestial terms. As a baby, your brain becomes attuned to the sorts of sounds used in your family's language, and as an adult it's very difficult to pick up on the specific sounds used in unrelated languages. This is why the Navajo language proved to be an unbreakable code during World War II. Neither the Japanese or even the Americans employing them could even recognize the basic elements of Navajo speech. Greeks hearing the language of the Red Sea folk were surely just as baffled. There is no way to compare the language to Greek, so they compared it to a familiar animal instead. As for snake eating, first note that reptiles thrive in the desert, and of course the herders would take advantage of the protein any snakes or lizards they find might offer. To the Greeks, this would have seemed exotic and worth repeating. And we should note that the earliest mentions simply state that the troglodytes ate snakes, but not exclusively. It took years for this modest statement to metastasize into the troglodytes being nurtured by the snakes. Before the founding of Berenice, this is what sailors or travelers would see routinely in the sparsely populated northern coasts of the Red Sea. And it's exactly what archaeologists have found and been excavating in the region, where they have found caves once used by travelers and herders for shelter. Almost certainly they would have been of the same culture that lives in the area today, the Beja, and wherever the classic sources describe troglodyte villages, tribes, and princes, they were describing the Beja. There are other possibilities. Aristotle's description of horsemen suggests the people of Aksum, who lived further south along the Red Sea. And the mention of troglodytes west of Egypt could be the Tubu, or it's just barely possible the Tuareg. One troubling detail is the account from Agatharchides of the troglodytes living in large, neat vaults. This sounds a lot like Petra, and there are similar seeming church communities in Ethiopia and Eritrea today, but none of these are old enough to be relevant to our story. Agatharchides wrote about 2 centuries too early to be describing Petra, and over 1,000 years too early for the Ethiopian examples. It's a troublesome detail, more so because Agatharchides provides our most detailed accounts. But otherwise, the theory is a good match for both the literary accounts and the anthropological evidence. It fits nicely with the statement that Cleopatra knew the language, as in her time, Berenice was active and contact with the Beja routine. The Pandora instruments made of white mangrove fits as well, as that species grows on the Red Sea shore, and there is sufficient contact between the Beja and the Mediterranean world to make it plausible for a Beja musician to be heard at the Isthmian Games, just as Athenaeus suggests. And finally, the fact that both the Romans and the Greeks used the term Troglodytica when describing the region, and that this name passed without remark, suggests that the identification of the local people, the Beja, as troglodytes was accepted at the time. Admittedly, it isn't the most romantic theory, but there is a final connection to be made, and it sits on this map. The Blemias are another bit of cryptocartography, one that might be the subject of a future video, a term found on maps just a few degrees south of the troglodytes. Like the troglodytes, Pliny the Elder put them in Central Africa and turned them into monsters, making them headless creatures with their faces on their chests. Role-playing games have turned up the whole headless bit up to 11. But the Blemmyes are much easier to identify than the troglodytes. They were originally described in Egyptian documents, but they show up in Roman accounts as both allies and enemies in battle. There's no controversy about who the Blemmyes represent. They are the same Beja peoples. When they were encountered as herders in the desert, they were the troglodytes. When they were soldiers at war, they were the Blemmyes. And there is little doubt. The locations match, the Egyptian and Beja traditions match, and, although you know my position regarding using linguistic evidence, in this case we're just using it to confirm an already sound theory. The Beja name for themselves is Blami, about as close to Blemmy as you can get. It's an amusing conclusion. For roughly 2,000 years, everyone believed that these two names, Troglodyte and Blemia, applied to two different people, and they made up distinct and imaginative myths about each. Only now do we realize they were one and the same people all along. I hope you enjoyed this little cryptocartographic journey. These videos are the most time-consuming kind for me to make. For every minute of video, there's at least 2 hours of research, and I can't tell you how many script revisions were required. But if you like them, let me know in the comments what other quirky things that you've seen on maps that you would like to see explained. And like, share, and subscribe.